Hi, I'm Rachel, and this is my AM reading video for Friday, April 14th, 2023, going up on a Saturday. Returning to my usual routine here, I hope, although this is a weird time to have my first AM reading video of the month because we're halfway through the month now, and I haven't updated you on any of my reading officially since last month. So the first thing I'll do, as I do for my first damn reading videos of the month, is link to my last literary newsletter down below, my March literary newsletter, where I include snippets of all the Goodreads reviews I wrote for the books I read that month. I have news that caught my fancy, literary news. I have a book pick that I took. I have a book quote that I chose from the books I read, etc., listed below. And so I don't intend to go too far into, any of that March reading. We got to move on into April definitely now, except to say I'll just briefly bring up this book, The Only Game in Town by Lacie Waldon, because the only time I referenced it last month was in my book haul when I got it from the library, and I ended up squeezing it at the end of my March reading, or, I started it in March anyway, and then put it on my newsletter, and it was written by a former critique partner. This is Lacie's third rom-com, and it is about... It's about the love affair between this guy whose grandfather was like the big millionaire benefactor to his small town in Georgia, and then the female love interest is an editor, a book editor, who instead of, living in New York, where you do, has decided to live in her, really kitschy, loving small town, well, mostly loving, I suppose. And the premise of the story is that this old guy dies and leaves his fortune to whomever wins this very mercurial game that he made up, where he forces people from the town to get into groups of two with one another, and he chooses the groups, and it's all based on people who don't like each other very much. And I went into this assuming, of course, that the love interests would be paired up, but instead they're paired with two different people, and it's a little, I guess, unusual, and there was complaints in the romance world, I think, about how there's a lot of other POVs and stuff going on, but it's a cute story. Not necessarily a believable story, but this is a rom-com. You don't have to necessarily go into the logistics of how this inheritance would work. But they do all sorts of zany, competitions against each other, and of course at the end it's all about coming together for love of each other and love of the town, and the two love interests get together. Rom-com spoiler alert, but yeah. Very happy that, her third book seems to have gone off with a bang. Okay, getting into my usual perennial AM reading stuff, I'm going to start by talking about a short story. I'm currently reading one short story per AM reading video in this anthology called Oi Caramba, an anthology of Jewish stories from Latin America, edited by Ilan Stavins. And the story I read this week is called The Conversion by Isaac Goldemberg. It is about a young man who is half Jewish, half Peruvian, and as he is setting up for his bar mitzvah, he also gets a bris, which is the circumcision. And so part of it is, the sort of, I wouldn't say hyper-graphic, but hyper-focused on the bris that he's getting, and goes a little bit into other sorts of angst. Part of it is that apparently this takes place when the Ten Commandments, starring Charlton Heston, was coming out in theaters in Peru, and they were the only Jews who were missing out on seeing that at a special time, apparently. So it's high on the, I don't know, narrative stuff, and not so much on sort of dialogue and action-packed. Although I think Goldemberg then turned it into the beginning of a novel. And I wonder if I would have read it differently if there was more context, like that this was the beginning of something rather than also the end of something, because it's just kind of so thick. I mean, I like the idea of it about, parsing Jewish identity from this vantage point, but it was, some of these stories are just so thick on narrative and not so much on anything else. So that's what I'm thinking about right now. The first book I technically started and finished this month is Who by Fire, Leonard Cohen and the SINAI by Matti Friedman. which I listened to on audio. And anyway, I read this in preparation for my Israel book club that my synagogue and one of the senior rabbis has put together, and we are meeting in a couple of days' time to talk about the book. And I've done something kind of unusual, that I finished the book, you know, a few days ago now, but instead of reviewing it, I thought I might just wait, because it's another book. I guess I'm not quite sure how I feel about it. There's something a little unfocused in a way. I mean, it talks about Leonard Cohen's decision to play in Israel during the Yom Kippur War, which was a very tumultuous time in the middle of a war that did not seem like, you know, it was uncertain what the outcome would be. There was a lot of mass casualties. And for Israel, I think the Yom Kippur War was sort of a defining point, and like that it was tied into a holiday that is very much about life and death, and the fact that literal death was, you know, raining down on them, and this, you know, really stunning surprise attack, as it were, that happened on Yom Kippur, when almost every Jew is, you know, in a religious service, a very spiritual place. So I don't know, that's part of it. And he's also, the tour was not all that well documented, and Cohen didn't talk about it much later in his career. So Matti Friedman is kind of like going back and forth between like what he can piece together of Cohen's inspirations for going, and then he finds who he can of the previous soldiers who actually went to the concert, and it gets into their experiences both with Cohen and in the war. So it felt a little like ping-pongy, and kind of like I couldn't quite get a handle on it. So I figured maybe I'd wait and let the book club discussion sort of guide me into what I want to say about the book. Because, you know, I do review everything on Goodreads, but right now that review is like TBR, or, you know, or I should say, I guess, to come. So yeah, it's a weird way to start the month, I guess. I'm feeling a little like on uncertain waters here, but there we go. The second book I finished is Human Blues by Elisa Albert, which I have indeed reviewed and I guess come to more complete thoughts about. I put this book on my list of 2022 releases that caught my fancy, that I wanted to read, because I feel like I have a weird relationship with Albert. I've read, I think, all of her books, and this is, I think, her third, and she wrote a book of short stories. And I feel like I've kind of fallen out of love with her in a way. It's weird. I'm not sure how much I ever was in love with her, because she writes the same sort of jaded pothead character over and over again, and it's very misanthropic to a certain degree, the way that she picks on the rest of society, and it just kind of gets old. And this book in particular, I think like a lot of her books, it's sort of much more about vignettes than about plot, which I'm not team plot over team character and story and whatever, but, you know, I don't know, in this case, she goes off on all these tangents, and I don't know. The book is about this woman, Aviva, who is in her mid-30s, wants to be a mother, is having trouble getting pregnant, and is very adamantly against, like, the fertility culture that veers into surrogacy and, you know, sorts of things that, and fertility drugs and the sorts of things that are unnatural. Like, she really wants to, you know, stick to more natural diet and medications, and it is a somewhat valid, I think, critique of the healthcare system, the westernized healthcare system, which, you know, sort of thoughtlessly puts women especially on a bunch of drugs, like, or like, you know, every time there's a problem with your menstruation system, you just, you know, go on birth control without, you know, really delving deeper into what's going on with anyone's specific biology, that sort of thing. So, I mean, there's a lot of critique to be had, but this character is so insufferable that I think most people just never would, you know, get to actually parsing through these interesting beliefs she has. And I kind of got tired of it too after a while. And, you know, this is leaning into polemic where all of the characters are stereotypes, and basically Albert creates a world for her character where her character is always right. Like, all of the people she comes across fit into her version of reality, and there's no deviation from that, really. Like, and so the character is never challenged, which, you know, I would think makes readers also less inclined to be challenged by a one-note character in a one-note world. So, I mean, sometimes the writing was intriguing to me. Sometimes I feel like Albert goes way out of her way to turn every sentence into a mocking joke with a lot of italics all the time in this book in particular. I don't know. So I don't think I don't think this book would be for, I don't know, a whole lot of people, unless you're a very specific sort of person looking for a very specific sort of critique and sort of sardonic character and that sort of thing. I mean, there's obviously an audience for this, and I keep coming back to her because I do want to be challenged by some of these ideas, but like her vehicle for doing it, I just think it's just, oh, it just gets so old and, you know, self-righteous after a while. I'm like, okay, enough already. So I don't know, maybe I'll keep that in mind the next time she comes out with a book. The next book I'm in the middle of reading now is Down Under by Sonia Taitz. This is one of my top of the Goodreads books, and that I put it on my Goodreads back in 2018, 2019. Now it's at the top of that TBR, and I made a resolution that it's one of the books I'm, you know, nixing this year and giving a chance, finally getting it off the TBR shelf. So now I'm reading it. And anyway, this is a book about two people. One is a middle-aged Jewish woman and one is a middle-aged non-Jewish man. They grew up together. They kind of, it seems like, had a little bit of a romance when they were teenagers. And since then, the man and his family moved to Australia, and he ultimately became a rugged, famous movie star. And the woman, you know, got married and had kids and is in ennui and that sort of thing. And it's about, it seems like, the possibility of them coming back together. The man, Colum, decides Jude, is the one who got away, and he comes back to America. And right now he seems to be posing as a instructor at a horse camp where Jude's younger son is I guess taking classes. It's sort of classes that are geared toward, you know, socially awkward teens needing social interaction sort of thing. And he's the teacher there. I'm not actually sure if he knows who Davy, the son, is or not, but I don't know. It's an interesting novel, I guess, although I don't think it's necessarily the best written, especially in the beginning. There was a lot of exposition and narrative heavy and just exposition heavy and background heavy. So like instead of like starting wherever the story started, she starts with, you know, giving a bunch of like reportage on who these characters are, and it's not that compelling. And finally we get into some scenes where there's actually like in-person action and dialogue, and I'm like, okay, good, you can do this, and maybe this is getting more interesting. We have a lot of stuff going on, more than just the two of them pining for each other. I mean, personally, I feel like Jude's presentation is more interesting to me. She has this friend who, kind of like her, is in a little bit of a loveless marriage, or they're going through the ennui of like middle-aged marriage with their husbands, but the friend gives off these vibes of being perfect, and Jude is like kind of resentful, especially since the narrative goes into ways maybe her life isn't so perfect, and, you know, maybe she's turning to like sort of this holistic food business she has going on to sort of deny that her husband and her daughter and her relationship aren't doing so well. And Jude, meanwhile, has these two sons, and one is sort of a stereotypical teenager who's sort of Mr. Popular and is kind of, I don't know, maybe even a little insensitive or mean-spirited, but normal about it. And the other one is hypersensitive and, like, you know, doesn't have a lot of friends, and it's about him kind of finding his way. I thought that stuff is a little more interesting than Colum coming back to claim her. His stuff is sort of the most interesting in that he had an abusive father and how he kind of is trying to move past that, and it seems like he, you know, he might have trauma with that as well, perhaps. And there's also some interesting, well, Jewish stuff and anti-Semitism that crops up in here, so it's kind of an interesting look at both of those issues that's not necessarily the main issue of the story. But yeah, that's where I am with this one so far. I guess I'm waiting to see if Jude and Colum are actually going to meet up in the present. I assume they are. And I will report back. And the final book I have to talk about, I can't really say much, but I'm listening to it on audio. This is Eating to Extinction by Dan Saladino. Anyway, this book is nonfiction, penned by a UK reporter who goes into food culture, and his general premise is that he is looking at the ways that our society, going back especially since the Industrial Revolution, and also really getting a kickstart, I guess, after World War II, has gone into these monocultures. We have far less diverse food, like for animals and grains and cereals and vegetables and etc. and how that's dangerous for our ecology and for like our own survival, that, you know, we just have a lot less food sources than we used to back in the past due to human systems that I won't go into in any more detail because I am reading this book for the BookTube Prize. So the BookTube Prize was started by Robert at Barter Hordes a few years ago, and the intent is to judge the best in literary fiction and nonfiction published in the US the year prior. And I am officially judging for the quarterfinals, the second of the 4 rounds, judging nonfiction Group A, and this is one of the books on my ballot of 6, and I have to read all 6 books and rank them at the end of May. And until then, I'm keeping mum because I don't want to influence anyone else with any opinions I have or be influenced. But if you would like to hear any of my preliminary thoughts about my ballot before I started reading, I just, you know, just sort of blabbed out some thoughts. I have a whole video where I go into that, and I'll link it down below, and also link to BookTube Prize information down below. So that about covers it for me now. Onward and upward with the weekend for me. Kind of looking forward to, you know, putting work behind me. Ended on a little bit of a dramatic note, which I think there's not much I can do with that, but I'd like to get some distance from it. And meantime, there's plenty of reading I want to do, and also writing. I'm in the middle of writing a fantasy novel, and I have some deadline stuff happening with that. So yeah, lots of fun stuff ahead for me. And I will be back on this channel in a couple of days to do a video where I actually can talk about the BookTube Prize. I am looking at an old Octafinals ballot from yesteryear, and I'm doing a tag about it, where the tag is to read like the first sentence or the first paragraphs of whatever books you want. And so I thought I would read this ballot of BookTube Prize books and then talk about them because, or, you know, read the first couple of paragraphs and then talk about them, which is exciting for me because I can't actually talk about what I'm officially judging, but I do love this prize, so stay tuned for that. And yeah, I hope you all had a great beginning half of the month of April and are looking forward to the second half. Thanks so much for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time.